Olá, meu nome é Felipe Martoni e hoje nós estamos aqui para conversar com o Dr. Martin Puchner, que é professor de drama e literatura comparada da Universidade de Harvard. Nós vamos conversar sobre o livro O Mundo da Escrita, como a literatura transformou a civilização. Eu sou um homem branco, cabelos longos, estou atrás de mim uma cidade, estou vestindo uma camisa rosa, eu uso óculos e estou numa sala de biblioteca. Martin, welcome. Would you mind describing yourself and your room, please?
Thank you, Felipe. Absolutely, and thanks first of all for the invitation. I'm a middle-aged white man with a blue shirt and glasses, and unfortunately, a lot less hair than Felipe. And I'm sitting in my study. You see white walls, a whiteboard where I've taken some notes, and I think that's about it.
Great. So, first of all, I just like to say that I loved your book, and it was quite an epic journey from the epic of Gilgamesh to Harry Potter. The scope of the book is quite breathtaking. And I guess this sort of brings me to my first question. Why did you choose to take this very broad perspective, very broad view of the history of literature? Why? Because it must have been very challenging.
You know, it was, but also thrilling. And the reason why I ended up there is that, you know, like I used to focus primarily on the 19th and 20th century and mostly Western literature. And I thought, I always thought I was broadly read. But then about 15 years ago, I was asked to edit an anthology, a large anthology of world literature. And I started to read very broadly, and very quickly I noticed two things. And the first was really that I didn't even know how much I didn't know, and that there was just such an unbelievable and fantastic range of literatures out there that I didn't even know had existed in the first place. And I realized that in trying to wrap my head around, with lots of collaborators, wrap my head around this large body of work, these 4,000 years of literature, that really for the first time in my life, I was assembling a larger picture of literature. And I realized that I had only been studying these tiny slices, and not just me, that most people who study literature do it that way. And so I think I had two impulses: A, to sort of proselytize, to convince people to read some of the texts that are less known in most Western literary education, and to assume that bird's eye perspective, because I came to think that it, of course, if you take a bird's eye perspective, if you look at 4,000 years of literature, you can't drill down in details. There are lots of things you don't see when you take that perspective. But there are other things that you can only see if you take that broad perspective, broad patterns, broad developments. And so I really got sort of almost addicted to that broad perspective, because it was new to me, because I had never taken it myself, and because I found few books that offered it. So that was sort of a conversion experience almost. And as I said, it happened about 15 years ago when I started to work on this anthology. And at some point I thought, I should, try to capture some of that in a book.
Yeah, and that got me wondering, how did you pick the episodes to describe? It must have been very, very difficult to choose.
It was impossible, totally impossible, but in a certain perverse way that actually made it easier, because it's clear that this book couldn't be representative or comprehensive. It's clear that the way I wanted to write it also in a immersive style. So it was clear that I decided to pick about 16, 17 episodes. What helped me make the decision, I think the decisions, hard as they were, is that I didn't just want to pick, I don't know, the 16 most important or best. That wasn't really my ambition. I wanted to tell a particular kind of story. And that was about the relation between storytelling and writing technologies. And so that's a particular story about invention of writing and paper and print and all these technologies. And so that helped narrow it down a little bit, because I knew which technologies were going to be important, although some surprised me. For example, paper turned out to be much more important than I would have thought beforehand. In any case, so I picked important texts that sat on these moments when new technologies came along. And so that particular story was sort of a selection criterion. It was a filter that allowed me to narrow things down a little bit. And then there were certain texts I really felt like I wanted to promote that were far less known. So for example, the Popol Vuh, the Great Maya epic, or the Epic of Sunjata, the West African epic that was transmitted orally for a long time and only really written down in the 20th century. So there are certain texts I also knew I want to write about them. I want to make a case for them.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's very interesting. You mentioned that you wanted the book to follow this thread of technology and writing. So you claim that literature was born when technology met oral storytelling. Would you mind telling us a bit about that happy marriage?
Yeah, so that perspective, in a sense, it was really born out of as all historical perspectives are, I suppose, the moment we live in. I mean, we live through this moment of an unusual moment, a rare moment of transformation in how texts are being written, how they're distributed, how they're being read, a real moment of technological transformation. So in a sense, I wanted to understand it by going back and look at earlier moments where something like this happened, such as the very first moment, the sort of Big Bang of literature, when writing, which had hitherto been mostly used to record economic transactions and sort of political transactions, were suddenly used to write down oral stories. And that happened in Mesopotamia in a particular format, namely clay tablets, in a particular writing system. And so from there, I follow some of the most important technologies, including the first invention of print in China, the invention of paper also in China, the way in which, for example, paper moves from China to the Arabic world, and then from the Arabic world to Europe through influenced Arab-occupied Spain and Al-Andalus. And so these different stories, different alphabets, the phonetic alphabet, different alphabets. So these were sort of the threads I picked out. But all the while, in the back of my mind, thinking about our transformation through electronic media and the internet and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I have a question about that, but I'm gonna leave that to the end. And you spend a lot of time discussing foundational texts, and I was wondering what is about those stories that made them become foundational texts?
Yeah, so that was one of the patterns that really stood out for me once I took that bird's eye perspective, how many of these early texts became reference points for entire cultures. And sometimes they were foundational epics like the Homeric epics or the Epic of Gilgamesh. Sometimes they became sacred texts. So that was another development that I somehow just took for granted. Of course, there's some sacred texts. Religions have sacred texts, but like all things that had to be invented at a certain moment, this idea that writing is sacred. So I looked at some of these sacred texts and some of these moments when that happened for the first time, including around the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, as Christians call it. And so that was really one of the patterns. And once these foundational texts were established, often because they told very broad stories, telling their audience in a way where they came from, why, the basic meaning-making operation, why they were here, why they lived in this corner of the world and not in another corner, often predictions about the future, often a kind of code to live by, question of morality. So answering very, very fundamental questions about why questions, why are we here, how should we live? And so once these texts had established themselves they were very difficult to dislodge. And what was interesting to me is that once these new writing technologies come along that often really transform the way literature operates and often gave rise to new texts and new genres, nevertheless, these old foundational texts were often the early adopters of these new technologies. So for example, Buddhist sutras in China were the earliest adopters of paper and print mass production because Buddhist monks wanted to proselytize, they wanted to spread the word. And then the same thing happens with the reinvention of print in Northern Europe with Gutenberg, where the Latin Bible becomes the first big text that's an early adopter. So that became a very striking pattern for me, just how much these early foundational texts managed to even expand their influence through these new technologies, and even as new genres like the novel or story collections and so on and so forth came along.
And do you think we now in the 21st century, we have foundational texts, or maybe we need foundational texts to make sense of the place we are now and where we're heading?
Yeah. We certainly have foundational texts. I mean, that's one of the things that I found so striking, that even though most foundational texts are thousands of years old, they are actually as influential today as they have ever been. And of course, the first texts to think about are religious texts. That I think we live in a world where basically all religions have foundational sacred texts. I mean, and I think we take that for granted, but it wasn't always that way, but it is now. So, and not just Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the religions of the book, but also Hinduism, Buddhism, but then there are other foundational texts. They're not just religious. They can be philosophical, as in the Confucian Analects, for example, or Plato's dialogues. They can be political. The United States is a country that's really founded, maybe more explicitly than many other countries, on a set of texts that are seen as quasi-sacred, namely the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. And we even have a group of priests called the Supreme Court that is in control of the interpretation of these texts. So I think they're with us, and we don't always realize quite how much we are shaped by them. And then, that brings me to your second question, namely whether we need them, or I think in a way I understand that should we have these foundational texts? And I think that's a good question, because I don't think that they're always an unmitigated good. In writing the book, I started to use the term textual fundamentalism, because both in the case of religion and in the case of these political foundational texts, they're sometimes used to, I think, very bad ends, especially when interpretive communities insist on original meaning, we have to go back to the world of 2000 years ago. And again, there are some members of the US Supreme Court who are so-called originalists, who insist on the original meaning. And that's, of course, something that comes out of the practice of reading religious texts. So I don't think we can simply get rid of these foundational texts, and I'm not sure we should, but we should make sure that we allow ourselves a lot of leeway in interpreting them and translating them, or whatever meaning they might give us, into our own time. I think that's sort of the conclusion I came away with.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. And if you allow me some liberty with the concept of foundational texts, what were your foundational texts that made you as a person, as a reader, a writer?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to tell you the truth, I've actually never asked myself that question. I think that's perhaps because I was so focused on this kind of bird's eye perspective, looking at Earth as if from outer space, that I never looked at myself that way. So, and I should preface this by saying that I don't think I was a particularly avid or obsessed or reader. My sort of intellectual awakening, or whatever you want to call it, came very late in high school and in college. So I was not a teenager who read all the time, though there are some texts. And so I guess if I think about it, there are certain fairy tales that really stuck with me. My mother was really interested in Russian fairy tales. So the witch Baba Yaga, who's sort of a figure from the Russian fairy tales, that is a figure, and these are certain texts that really stayed with me. But when I was sort of an adolescent, this is not surprising. I like many, I read Lord of the Rings. I think that was actually one of the few books I read several times. As I said, I was not an avid reader. And then later came other texts. But those two, perhaps, from childhood and early adolescence. But then, that experience I mentioned earlier of 15 years ago of starting to read much more broadly, that for me was a real transformative experience, coming relatively late in my life. So I guess there have been various moments where intensive reading experiences happened.
Yeah, in one of your interviews, you mentioned that The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco was an inspiration for your style and how to reach broader audiences. So I guess that will be another foundational text for you.
Felipe, you're so right. And I studied in Italy, in Bologna. Though unfortunately Umberto Eco was more or less on leave that year, but I was able to attend a couple of lectures by him, and I was a huge fan, especially the way he combined storytelling and research and sort of unfolding these worlds, these obscure texts, obscure figures, but bringing them alive. I had no such ambition. I didn't think that I could do anything remotely like it when I was a student, but as I, in recent years, tried to experiment more with different approaches to writing, that experience with Umberto Eco definitely came back to me, and I guess I tried to imitate him a little bit. Yeah.
Great. I think I'd like to ask you perhaps a tougher question. I was wondering, in the book you mentioned that Socrates' notorious hostility towards writing, and many philosophers and writers and thinkers more generally, they say that they think in writing, that writing helps them think better and get clearer ideas. Do you think writing has changed the way we think too?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, I think one of the basic assumptions, if you will, or again, patterns I saw is that in this book, and this is why I focus on writing technologies, is that different technologies really change. They change, we tell stories, they change, we think, because it changes how we imagine readers, what kinds of, even the literal, whether you write by longhand or you cut and paste, you have different access, or ancient editors who just wrote across earlier writing. And I mean, all of these technological, if you will, questions really have definitely a shaping influence. And I think you can see that. But it's interesting that you mentioned the Socrates and Buddha and Jesus and Confucius, those figures to whom I also devote one chapter, which for me is, in a sense, the linchpin of the whole book, because they refused to write. And it really forced me to confront the fact that here I was writing about writing and writing technologies. And it forced me to write about orality, or what happens when you don't write, which is also why I wrote in one of the last chapters, several of the last chapters are about almost a kind of return to orality, or orality that exists side by side, writing technologies, sometimes in the case of censorship, as in the case of Anna Akhmatova, or because there are strong oral traditions that exist alongside writing, as in the case of the Epic of Sanjata in West Africa. But this Socrates, why do these figures refuse to write? Why are they so skeptical about this technology? It again echoed, I think, with some of our misgivings about our technology, screen time, and so on and so forth. I think whenever there's a new technology, there are certain fears attached to it, from the downfall of civilization to, I don't know, childhood education or a question of addiction. People worried about that in the 19th century with novels, that they were becoming addictive. So I think there are all kinds of interesting questions, but specifically about this question of philosophy, and why these philosophers refuse to write, and it's very hard to find today people who would say that, you couldn't have a career as a philosopher, for example. And I say this because I know that you just completed your PhD in philosophy and I have a background in philosophy. So I did think about that. And, one thing that struck me is that while it's absolutely true that, especially academic philosophy as it's practiced in universities, you need to publish, you need to write. It's a very important process. But orality in philosophy, I would say, it's actually more important than in many other disciplines. And you see that if you go to a philosophy colloquium or conference, that people interrupt each other, they start to argue in the middle of talks, that and in a way that can sometimes strike people from other disciplines as perhaps aggressive. Wait a minute, what are your assumptions? That kind of interaction, I think, is actually more important in philosophy than, for example, in literature, where that would never happen at a conference. So I think there are actually vestiges of that Socratic moment, if you will, in the way the field of philosophy really values that live argument, the back and forth, the interaction. And I think that remains actually an important part of the discipline, I would say. Is that also your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And especially the part where it can seem very aggressive, as you said, but most of the time is very friendly. It's later we go to the pub and get a drink together, and no hostility whatsoever. But yeah, it can sometimes strike people as too aggressive or too, yeah. And what I feel is that I myself, I cannot think very well if I don't write. And when I read about Socrates' hostility, and he refused to write, I was wondering, well, I think I could never have the thoughts I have if I couldn't write them down. So it helps me clarify what I'm thinking. And I guess much of contemporary philosophy and other disciplines as well, they benefited immensely. The quality of the ideas and the rigors of the thinking, I think they're that cannot be that will not be possible without writing, I guess.
I totally agree. Although it's interesting. I just half an hour ago, a friend and colleague in Israel, Nana Ariel, just sent me an article of hers. She just published in the philosophy and psychology journal Psyche about talking to yourself while you walk down the street. And she makes the argument that that's sort of another way of thinking out loud, and that it's often you're sort of ostracized, so you think, oh, this person is sort of eccentric when you catch yourself talking to yourself, mumbling to yourself, when you walk down the street. And she mentions this article by the German writer Kleist that's entitled "On the Gradual Formation of Thought While Speaking." And it's sort of about it's about that process. So I totally agree with you, but I would say it doesn't have to be writing. It can also be talking out loud, and perhaps ideally to someone else, but also to yourself when you walk down the street.
Yeah, that's I don't tend to do that, but maybe I'll try.
You should. I recommend it highly.
And another episode that I want to talk about, you mentioned in your book, is when you went to Troy and you felt disappointed. And in that chapter about Cervantes, you mentioned that he was very aggressive against the romance. Don Quixote is all about that. So that got me wondering. Usually we think that literature enriches our experience and provides us new ways to look at the world. We have concepts like Shakespearean and Dickensian. And if you go to Rio, for example, and you read Machado de Assis, one of our greatest writers, it's hard not to see Rio through his eyes. And I was wondering, can it sometimes be a bad thing to see the world through literature? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. And that was, I mean, in a way, it's a version of the discussion we had about foundational texts and sometimes their negative impact. Because yes, of course, you know, I love literature. We all here because we love literature. And in this book, I thought to myself very much that I want to write about the power of literature, and I did. But once you do that, you realize that power is not always to the good, and not just in the case of certain religious texts that are interpreted by certain priests or Supreme Court justices in a very conservative and so on and so manner, but more generally, no, it's true. I mean, I think this is, in a way, once you concede or once you realize the power of something, and I almost started to think of storytelling in literature as a tool, you realize that this is a tool that can be used in all kinds of ways. And I think any honest look at literature and its effects has to come to that conclusion, that it's not always good, even though we in literature tend to, you know, we feel like people out there don't recognize how important and wonderful literature is, or we feel like, oh, you know, young people don't read as much, and they're always kinds of, or if only people read more, they would have more empathy with other points of view. And I share, by the way, I don't want to make fun of these attitudes. I share them all. But at the same time, if you take a look at history, you realize that you know, their literature can also, any story, whether literary or philosophical or political, can be terribly misleading. They can and as you mentioned, it's so interesting that certain writers and Cervantes, you know, maybe most famously, was very attuned to that.
Yeah, an episode that also occurred to me later is when Goethe wrote Werther, that there was a wave of suicides. So that's an interesting case in which you see the world through literature. Then that's not always a good thing.
I think that's true.
And I think this sort of brings me to my next question. The theme of this book fair is utopias old and new. And we've seen in the past decades a surge in dystopian fiction in all sorts of media, but not so for utopian storytelling. And it got me wondering why this is the case. Why do you think we don't have as much utopian storytelling as we do dystopian fiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think I haven't thought very deeply about this, but if I were just to speculate a bit, I think on the one hand, there is, I mean, why there are a lot of dystopians, I think that I don't think that requires a particular explanation. We can all, I think, imagine many reasons. Though, I mean, it's interesting, for example, you know, I've just written a little book that's about to come out on climate change in literature. And there I do sometimes wonder whether certain traditions of apocalyptic, of a kind of apocalyptic imagination may actually be also detrimental to actually creating change. So I've been starting to think a little bit about that, why certain cultures, and here, you know, Christian cultures in particular, seem to be somehow prone to a kind of apocalyptic imagination that I don't think is universal at all. That seems to be, in some sense, culturally specific. So that's worth thinking about. But on the other side, on the utopia side, I mean, they're you know, utopias have come in for a lot and probably justified critique. That often they were you know, the classical utopias of Moore and others were often very rigid places that no one actually wants to live in, and that their real purpose was a kind of critique of present-day society, actually. So I don't know how many utopias that you know. So I think that writing utopias became discredited in a certain way, and you know. But it's interesting to. It's the last thing I'll say about it. Again, just speculating in the moment here, that there are certain writers of dystopias. I'm thinking of Margaret Atwood, for example, who then starts to, especially in the Oryx and Crake, in that trilogy, you know, that takes place after a kind of biological virus that wipes out a lot of people, that she starts to imagine a kind of new mode of life, new mode of living. The gardeners becomes almost a kind of cult. It's an ambivalent thing. But so I wonder whether in certain dystopias, and I'm thinking of Margaret Atwood, you can find elements of a utopia and vice versa. So maybe it would be worth thinking about them not as sort of opposed genres, but as intertwined ones.
Yeah, this is a strange situation, I think, because I agree with you that maybe writing and too much dystopias can be a bad thing, because it drains out all the hope, and it doesn't promote change, right? And I read an article, New York Times, just last week, I think, and the author made the same point. And I was wondering, maybe we need more utopian storytelling. What do you think? Is it something that maybe we need now? You said it also, you said in an interview to a Brazilian outlet that maybe in this age of globalized literature, we might start seeing stories that help us create this global sense of shared destiny and that sort of thing. Maybe there's something there about to be explored. What do you think?
I know, absolutely. And I do think that that's, when it comes to something like climate change, there's been so much emphasis, of course, rightly so, on climate science. And for, say, 40 years, the idea was if the climate science becomes better, then people and, the predictions go from 85% to 98%, then people will, believe it and change. And it's become, I think, very clear that that's not the case. So I do think that there's something that we as people who are sort of in the world of literature and think about storytelling have something to contribute there to this very urgent problem. There's no doubt that it's very urgent. So the way I think about it is that it's interesting. I didn't so much think about it in terms of either utopias or dystopias, but it's implied in terms of agency. What kind of agency do we have? And the problem with apocalyptic thinking is that it's, humans have no agency in that. It seems as in something that's inevitable. So I've started to think a lot about agency and what kinds of agents different literary genres imagine. Do we need, a hero who will lead us down a different path? Probably not. So I started to think about sort of forms of literature that imagine collective action and collective agents. And actually, one of the models I'm interested in, and I even have a chapter on that also in the, the written world. It's the Communist Manifesto, not because I believe in the particular assumptions, no, I think they're interesting, but because it's a text that imagines a new collective agent called the proletariat. And that's not just exploited workers. The manifesto tries to shape that group into an agent of history. And so that strikes me as one of the models. If we look back at the last 4,000 years of literature, it seems to me at least an attempt that it's worth studying from that perspective. I'm not necessarily saying we need a new manifesto, but it seems one of the places where collective agency, collective acts, where a text tries to imagine how history can be changed. And did that for a period very successfully. So whether for good or ill is another question, perhaps.
Yes, because this is a curious situation, because if we are so desperate for change, so desperate for to make a difference, to change reality and change the way things are arranged right now, why aren't manifestos a popular genre now?
Yeah, no, and that I have thought about, and I think one answer is that we have, in a certain way, we are at a cultural moment where and for many good reasons, are very hesitant to speak for someone else. There's a lot of emphasis on, my lived experience and your lived experience, and I don't want to assume that I know what that experience is like, rightly so. And so all these manifestos, they're based on a we, on this collective, on some kind of collective, and someone writes in this form of we and assumes a lot of people under that umbrella. And I think that we have become quite queasy about it because we're very, conscious of the difference between groups and subgroups and so on and so forth. And it's true that it would be probably impossible to say, we'll just delegate someone to write a manifesto for all of us. That it's probably not very practical, but the conclusion I come to with that it has to be that we have to envision also collective acts of storytelling, which is why I've become very interested in these medieval story collections like 1001 Nights, because there are many, many voices that are being sort of collected in these frame tale narratives. And again, I'm not saying literally we need to come up with a new 1001 Nights, but it's another model I can think of where there's a collective act of storytelling that would maybe get us around the hesitation people have in just writing a manifesto for all of us.
And related to that, I was wondering also if maybe science fiction wouldn't be a great genre in which to frame and address these issues, because I feel that science fiction it's easier to see ourselves as a part of a shared humanity, and to take this step back and look to our shared destiny and our shared responsibilities. Do you think that maybe science fiction might be the genre of the future?
I think so. I think there is something really interesting happening both around science fiction and fantasy literature. I mean, this is why I ended with Harry Potter, even though I didn't grow up reading Harry Potter. And it's interesting that both, over the course of the 20th century, they were often dismissed as genre fiction, had a much lower status than literary fiction. And I think that's really changing. We're seeing, literary writers using many more elements of both science fiction and fantasy, and on the other hand, writers of science fiction, fantasy literature, at least of some, gaining real literary status. And I think that's a positive thing, because I agree that, I think instead of writing utopias in the old style, science fiction and fantasy are ways of imagining alternative forms of alternative lives, alternative forms of social relations, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot there. And it's interesting that they're so popular. That shows that readers crave that thought experiment, that imagination to think of alternative forms of life.
And going back to philosophy, do you think how do you see the relation between philosophy and literature, especially fiction? Because you have a background in philosophy, as we talked about earlier, and they seem sometimes to be in tension with each other, or how do you see they have similar goals, and what are their differences?
No, to me it's a really fascinating question, and now I know to you too, Felipe. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that in trying to write the history of written stories, 4,000 years of it, and especially in the ancient world, you realize that our distinction between philosophy and fiction, for example, didn't really exist. I mean, the concept of fiction, of literary fiction, is in some sense only a few hundred years old, I would say. It really is born or comes into its own in the 18th century with Romanticism and so on and so forth. So it's like an imaginative form of elevated writing as fiction, as sort of the gold standard of fiction. And this is why I've been interested in forms of philosophy. I have this chapter on the Confucian Analects and the Buddhist Sutras and the Platonic dialogues that are sort of literary, or at least they're written in a very distinct form, and in some ways are both literary and philosophical. And in other work I've done, I've been interested in similar sort of literary aspects of philosophy in 20th century philosophy, like Wittgenstein is a perfect example, who clearly struggles a lot in how to capture in the right literary form to capture his different thoughts and philosophies. So this is, I think this is something that in the most provocative form, you could say that in this expanded understanding of literature that I adopted, and I think which you have to adopt if you look at 4,000 years, philosophy is part of literature, with a capital L, because even arguments are stories in the sense that they're sequenced thoughts, sequenced points that are made. There's an arc. There's going from A to B to C. I mean, it's an extremely specialized form of storytelling, you could say. And so from that bird's eye view, so that's the first point. The second point, once we are sort of in the modern world where you have these specialized genres as we know them today, including literary fiction and philosophy, I think it's perhaps less helpful to say, oh, they're all one, but it's more interesting to see then how they borrow from each other, and they constantly do. And so that does suggest a kind of complementarity that for example, I've written a book on the drama of ideas, where I look at philosophical dialogues and the tradition of philosophical dialogues from Plato onward, and then dramatists who are particularly shaped by certain philosophical writers, such as Beckett and Shaw and the existentialists and so on and so forth. So there's a constant traffic. And I think that's something that our academic disciplines that try to create very hard and fast boundaries don't always see. Now, again, I wouldn't say that, oh, it's all the same, but it's very interesting to see how they borrow from each other.
Because some philosophers think that great literature is valuable, or one of the greatest values of literature is because it can communicate or convey truths about the world and about ourselves, and moral truths perhaps. And that will make them, philosophy and literature, similar in their goals, right? I'm not sure if you agree with that. Of course, literature has the aspect of entertainment and other properties that you cannot find in philosophy per se. But that will make them similar in their objectives if these philosophers are right.
No, I think that I can see that, though I personally, when I would describe that, I wouldn't necessarily use the word truths, because it's a very philosophical term. And I understand that certain philosophers are very interested in, sometimes they say it's truths that cannot be expressed in simple propositions, in the language of philosophy, let's say. And that's true. I mean, for me, the way I would describe storytelling in a sort of philosophical sense is that it orients you in the world. If you tell a story, you have to construct a world. You have to think about how that world works, what laws apply to it. And that's something that science fiction, for example, is very explicit about. You have to think about causality, how you get like laws of history to a certain extent, because you have to think about what drives the story forward. Is it the action of an individual? Is it an environment? Is it social laws? Is it the progression of capitalism? Is it revolutions? I mean, you have to, in a sense, at least implicitly figure out how this world works and how individual agency relates to this larger environment. So that for me, there's, if you will, proto-philosophical thought that goes into storytelling that way, where very important decisions are made by storytellers. And then looking at it from the perspective of readers, of course, yes, because also storytelling happens in language. in literature, and we all know that we don't have to be too mechanistic about it, but language shapes the way we see the world. And so a work of great fiction creates a new language, right? It's work on language. It makes things, it articulates things that couldn't have been articulated before. So, you could call that truths. I don't think it's necessary to use that term, but maybe others find it important, and I can see why.
Yes, I'm not sure where I stand on that debate, but I'm particularly attracted to this, to your view that literature helps us to explore new ways of looking at things, and that's, I think, is the power of literature. And this brings me to my next question: is you're a researcher, obviously, and but you're also an educator. And you spend a lot of time and energy to create the open course on masterpieces of world literature, and you teach at Harvard. And what do you think is the importance of teaching literature from childhood to the higher education?
I mean, in a way, it's a little bit what we just talked about, that I do think that literature, in a sense, expands, and like philosophy also, I would say, expands sort of what it is possible to think and imagine. And again, not always for the good, but it is an expansion, and that itself seems to me extremely valuable, that you enter a world or a thought process of someone that you can sort of think alongside a writer, and that expands, that shows you something that you weren't able to see, and that means to think before, a language for describing something that you had only a sort of dim sense existed before. So that's how I would describe the importance of literature and philosophy and other sort of cultural interaction with other cultural artifacts, music or paintings, and so on and so forth. And I think because of that, I'm someone who's never been as hung up on a specific canon, because I feel like that expansion, that experience, that benefit, if you will, from interacting with culture can happen with almost anything in some sense. I mean, it's not all the same, but there are great many works of literature and great many unbelievably important works of other arts and cultural imagination. And I think that expansion can happen, in certain individuals. They may resonate with at a certain moment in their lives particularly. And so you have to be very eclectic. I think it's totally fine to be eclectic. I think education spends too much time worrying about, this is my tradition, or this is your tradition, or you have to really know a lot about this in order to even begin to get any benefit out of reading this or interacting with a piece of sculpture. And I don't think that's true. Now, I think it's important to learn about the context of these works. I think it enriches your understanding of them, definitely. And that's part of also the benefit, that it evokes curiosity, because you're struck by something and you maybe don't know very much about it, but it provokes you, it does something to you, and you want to learn more about it. So that's, in a way, that's where what I find the most important about teaching and interacting with culture, and this is why I've started to be much more eclectic in what I teach, and why a lot of what I teach is not necessarily for future literature PhDs, but I really like teaching these much more broader general education courses, and why I created that online course you mentioned, because I think this is a very fundamental, very basic benefit that a lot of everybody can, should be available, and it shouldn't be available just to specialists. So in a sense, I've become, I know this is a dangerous word to use, but a bit of a populist when it comes to education.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Do you see any relevant differences between using literature in childhood education, or how it should be? Do you have any views on that, on how literature should be uh, used in children's education, or how it is different from how it is used to educate in higher education? Do you see?
Yeah. Well, I think that in school in secondary in school education, I think literature in most countries is still used primarily. There's a huge focus on national tradition, right? And I think that's true in most countries, and where literature is, in a sense, because it's connected to language and a certain country's canon of literature, national canon. So I mean, I think it's fine to study national traditions, and sometimes that can be very enlightening. But overall, I feel like there's much too much focus on that. So that would be my, and that's not just true of school, but even in universities. You know, most literature departments are national literature departments. They're, you know, that's how the literary education is configured, and that just seems to me. I don't believe in that kind of cultural nationalist project, I suppose. And it's odd to me that I think a lot of people who teach literature don't really believe in it, and yet they exist in an organizational structure, namely national literature departments, where that's sort of baked into it. So that's something I would change. I think teach much more world literature at an early age, and I don't know enough about different, you know, countries' high school curricula. There may well be some countries that do it much better than others. So that's something I would change, because I do really believe in that, in literature as circulating and allowing different points of view. And as I said, I think that sometimes artificial barriers are erected around that. Sometimes it has to do with, oh, if you can't read that work in the original, reading it in translation is really not worth it. That somehow debased, you don't really get anything out of that. That's one barrier that I don't believe in. I think reading literature in translation can be a great experience. Or, as I said, oh, before you even approach this work, you would have to study you know, for years to even get something out of it. And I don't believe in that either.
So I'm guessing that's why you wrote that chapter on Goethe's idea of world literature, right?
Exactly. And that, you know, it's interesting. I grew up just about 100 miles from Goethe, but I had Goethe stuffed into me in high school, and didn't think that I would. I really, you know, I reacted quite negatively against that, and I didn't know about his idea of world literature, and came back to it much later when I, you know, got interested in these things, as we've been talking about, and was really struck by the fact that the context in which he developed that idea of world literature, and it was, you know, he lived in a very provincial place in Weimar. It had only about 7,000 inhabitants, a very provincial town in Eastern Germany, but and the cultural world of the time was very focused on France, especially in these small German courts. People spoke French, and French literature was sort of the gold standard, and then maybe English literature. So people around Goethe started to do things. Either they were really focused on French literature, the sort of dominant literature, or they started to become German nationalists and started to study German fairy tales and so on and so forth, as happened in other countries as well. But Goethe rejected both of these options. He wanted an alternative to just always going to French literature as a kind of default, but he also rejected the reaction to that, namely nationalism. On the contrary, he said we need to read even more widely. So he tried to get his hands on certain Chinese novels that were just starting to be translated, and he read all 3 Chinese novels. That was all that he could find in translation. He started to read Arabic and Persian poetry. He started to teach himself Arabic even at an advanced age. He read Sanskrit plays in translation again. And so he realized that even though I'm sitting here in this very provincial town, I have access to literature from far away that none of my other people seem to be paying attention to. And so that's when he said, or it occurred to him in a conversation, by the way, in an oral conversation that his secretary wrote down, almost like Plato and Socrates, you know, we talked about this earlier, that he said we no longer live in or national literature shouldn't matter as much anymore. We live in a new age of world literature. And I think that was really prescient. I mean, that's obviously much more true today than it was in 1827 when he coined this term. And so, yes, it became something of a red thread for me, or sort of a goal, or I was intrigued to see how late it was that this term world literature was coined, that it was not coined in one of the cosmopolitan cities like Paris or London, but in this provincial town. So it was interesting.
Yeah, it was one of my favorite chapters because I had no idea that I would never imagine that Goethe, this national German figure, would have such an open mind and such wide interests in literature. I found that fascinating.
And it really also shows, you know, exactly. So he would have been shocked to see himself turned into this, you know, national poet. And it's what happened when what people do with literature, they press it into their own project, into their own purpose. You know, even someone who was explicitly against national literature couldn't help that.
And we're moving to the end, unfortunately. And I have two more questions. Since we are in a library, and you're in your book you mentioned libraries. You point out how important they were for shaping the written world, the world of literature. First by preserving texts, and then by lending them to people. Now we're in a modern world, in modern libraries. How do you see the importance of libraries today, besides just lending books to people?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and yes, I mean, in a sense, a sort of sub-theme of the book is both libraries that preserve books, but also libraries that go up in flames, or book burning, sometimes explicit book burning. So the preservation and destruction of literature became a theme and something I thought a lot about. And so I think both, so the preservation of literature is important even today, even though we live in a time where the cost of storage has gone down so radically, and it seems so easy and cheap to preserve things. But, you know, preservationists say that because of the outdatedness of file changing in file formats and so on and so forth, it's actually, just because something exists somewhere in the cloud doesn't mean it will always remain accessible. So preserving actual physical paper copies, I think, actually remains important. And I understand that it's expensive and that libraries, you know, get rid of duplicates and so on and so forth. I understand that, but I think that actual physical copies remain important to keep them because, you know, corpora of text that were digitized in the 90s, for example, sometimes already no longer accessible. So it's not as easy to preserve things digitally as it sometimes seems. But the other thing is that the other conclusion I came to when thinking about how do we make sure that literature survives, that texts survive, it's not just about their physical survival, though that's important. You know, the Epic of Gilgamesh was preserved only because it was on clay tablets that survived a fire, were even baked in a library fire. So it can be very important. But the other thing, and probably more important thing, is what we just talked about, namely education. Because the thing is, we humans don't preserve things we don't find useful or meaningful anymore. And so, and I don't think anything will change that. So I think the most important thing that libraries can do, and a lot of libraries have become, or maybe they have always been great at it, is not just to collect and preserve and maybe reluctantly lend. That's been sometimes the case, in some libraries, but actually to create a culture of literature, to hold readings, to host a literary festival, as this wonderful new library you're sitting in is doing right now, to create a culture of reading and to make it relevant for the next generation. I think that's the single most important thing, more important even than what writing formats, what digital formats, what the preservation. So these two things, thinking about physical preservation, but above all, creating a vibrant culture that is relevant for the next generation, whatever it takes to do that, I think we must do, because that's the only thing that will actually guarantee that literature survives.
You're absolutely right. And you say many times in the book that you are optimistic about the future, despite all this, these worries people have about the new technologies and the internet, and the young people just play video games and that sort of thing. And could you tell us why you're optimistic about the future?
Yes. Well, the first thing is, I think, because I mentioned earlier that new writing technologies often were accompanied by anxieties about the decline of civilization in one way or another. And by looking at these earlier moments that introduced a new technology, I realized that similar wars happened there. I mean, my favorite example is these fragments, papyrus fragments of Egyptian scribes, from thousands of years ago, where there are two types of fragments from scribal schools, from schools. One is from students who complain about their teachers, saying, the teachers are too strict, they beat me. Well, we don't do that anymore, hopefully, but they're very strict, they're taskmasters, I don't want to go to school anymore. And the other are from teachers who are saying, this generation of students no longer really cares about literature. It was different when we went to school, we really cared about literature. And to see that from 3,000 years ago, or Socrates talked about it earlier, Socrates worries about writing as a technology that you completely lose control over, that will make your minds atrophy, and so on and so forth. So you realize that new technologies are disruptive. They're genuinely disruptive. We experience that, I think, today with social media and so on and so forth. But they, in the past, at least, they have not led to what we would, in retrospect, describe as a simple decline of civilization. On the contrary, they've often democratized and spread culture. So I think it's mostly because of that I myself also find myself, of course, worrying about kids who only play video games and all of that. I share all of that, but then I try to catch myself doing that. And I remember these Egyptian scribes, and I remember Socrates, and I remember these earlier moments that in retrospect seem so ridiculous and overblown and apocalyptic again in their imagination. And so I then try to focus on, I think, what are some of the genuine benefits of these new technologies that almost always have led to a democratization. I think our own technologies are leading to a democratization of publishing, right? With print, it was very easy to become a reader. It was mass production of literature. You could become a reader. The barriers were lowered. But the barriers for becoming an author were still very, very high. And that's, of course, really changing. And that's disruptive. That's disruptive for the people who like to hold power over the written world. That's disruptive for the industry, the publishing industry, and so on and so forth. But I think ultimately, I do believe, despite all the worries we've articulated in this interview about foundational texts and the fact that stories are not always for the good and so on and so forth, I do believe in the democratization of literature. And I do believe that our technology has, not perfectly, and there are lots of problems connected to it, but it has contributed to that. And so that's, I think, ultimately the reason for optimism, or for at least for being skeptical of the pessimists, including my own pessimistic voices that I detect within myself from time to time.
That's great, Martin. I think that's a great way to end our conversation. It's been a pleasure. I was very happy to have you here with us talking about literature and philosophy. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
It was fantastic, Felipe. Thank you so much. And of course, it would have been even better to sit together in that beautiful library. But thank you, Zoom, for making it happen. Again, speaking about technology, it was a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.